I never expected a person to become a presence. That's the only way I know how to describe what changed. Because at some point, you stopped being someone I noticed and became something I carried with me. Not in a way that demands attention, not in a way that interrupts everything else, but in a quiet, almost invisible way that slowly changed the way I experience things. And that's what makes it difficult to explain, because the things that affect us the most are not always the loudest. Sometimes they arrive silently. Sometimes they don't announce themselves as important. They simply become impossible to ignore. That's what happened here. I didn't wake up one day and decide that you mattered. There was no single moment where everything shifted, no dramatic realization, no obvious us turning point. It was smaller than that. A collection of moments, a series of small recognitions that slowly formed something larger than I expected. The way you understood things before I explained them. The way you noticed changes I thought I had hidden. The way you seemed to recognize what was behind my words instead of only listening to the words themselves. Most people listen to respond. You listen to understand. And there is a difference between those two things that most people never learn. Because responding is easy. Understanding requires presence, it requires patience, it requires seeing someone as they are instead of seeing them through your own expectations. And somehow, without trying, you did that. You didn't come into my life trying to solve me. You didn't approach me like I was something to decode. You didn't treat my silence as a problem that needed to be fixed. You simply allowed me to exist. And strangely enough, that was the thing that made me feel seen the most, because I've always known how to be around people. I know how to communicate. I know how to show the parts of myself that are easy to understand. Everyone has those parts, the parts that are acceptable, the parts that don't require explanation, the parts that fit comfortably into someone else's perception. But there are other parts, the quieter ones, the deeper ones, the ones that don't come out easily because they are too often misunderstood. Those are the parts most people never reach, not because they aren't allowed to, but because most people don't have the patience to stay long enough. They want immediate understanding, immediate connection, immediate access. But some things cannot be rushed. Some things have to be recognized slowly. And somehow you recognize them without forcing your way through. That was different because I'm used to protecting distance. Not because I don't care about people, but because distance creates clarity. It allows me to decide what I reveal, what I keep private, what I allow someone else to know. There has always been a space inside me that belongs only to me, a place where thoughts exist before they become words, a place where feelings exist before they become explanations, a place where I don't have to translate myself. And for a long time, I believed nobody could enter that space. Not because nobody was capable, but because very few people even notice it exists until you did. You didn't demand access. You didn't ask me to open the door. You simply stood close enough that I realized I wasn't keeping it closed anymore, and that realization was unexpected, because control has always been important to me. Knowing where I stand, knowing what something means, knowing what to expect. But you introduced something I couldn't organize, something I couldn't categorize, I couldn't reduce into a simple explanation, and that bothered me, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. I'm comfortable with things I understand. I can analyze them, I can prepare for them, I can decide how much space they deserve. But this didn't arrive like that. This didn't ask to be understood before it existed. It existed first. Understanding came later. And maybe that's what made it different, because sometimes the deepest connections are not built through endless conversations. Sometimes they are built through recognition, through that strange feeling of encountering someone who doesn't feel completely unfamiliar. Someone whose presence creates a sense of familiarity that logic cannot fully explain. Not because you know their entire story, not because you share every experience, but because something about the way they exist feels recognizable, the way they think, the way they observe, the way they respond to the world. It feels like finding a language you didn't know you already understood, and that is rare, very rare, because most connections are based on what people show, but this felt different. It was based on what remained even when nothing was being shown, the pauses, the quiet moments, the things left unsaid. Those became the places where everything became clearer. And that's what surprised me. The silence was never empty with you. Usually silence creates distance. Usually silence creates questions. Usually silence makes people uncomfortable because they feel the need to fill it. But with you, silence became its own form of communication. It felt like there was no pressure to perform, no need to constantly prove something, no need to create a version of myself that would be easier to accept. And that kind of freedom is rare, because being understood is one thing. Being accepted after being understood is something else entirely. Anyone can accept an incomplete version of someone. The real question is whether they can accept the complete one, the complicated one, the quiet one, the one that doesn't always make sense. And somehow, you never seemed interested in changing what you found. You didn't try to make me louder. You didn't try to make me different. You didn't try to pull things out of me before I was ready. You just allowed things to exist naturally. And that made me question something I thought I already knew. Maybe connection isn't always about finding someone who completes you. Maybe sometimes it's about finding someone who doesn't make you feel incomplete. Someone who doesn't require you to become something else before you are worthy of being understood. That difference matters, because there are people who love the version of you that benefits them, and then there are people who recognize you even when there is nothing to gain. Those people are rare. And when you find one, you notice. You notice because something inside you becomes quieter. The constant need to explain yourself starts disappearing. The need to defend your thoughts starts fading. The need to carefully choose every word becomes less important. Not because you stop caring, but because you realize someone is finally listening beyond the words, and that changes something. It changes the way you exist around them. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you understand yourself, because sometimes another person doesn't give you a new identity. Sometimes they simply reveal parts of yourself you had forgotten were there. That is what this feels like. Not being changed into someone else, being reminded of something that was already inside. And maybe that's why it feels so powerful. Because you didn't create something new, you uncovered something that was already waiting. And once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend you didn't see it. That is the difficult part. Awareness changes responsibility. Once you recognize something, ignoring it becomes a choice. And I have never been someone who chooses ignorance. If something matters, I examine it. If something feels real, I acknowledge it. Even when acknowledging it creates uncertainty, even when it forces me outside the boundaries I created. And this has done exactly that. It has challenged the way I understand closeness. It has challenged the way I understand trust. It has challenged the belief that everything meaningful must be built slowly through predictable steps. Because sometimes something feels familiar before it becomes familiar. Sometimes someone feels important before you understand why, and maybe that is what makes it difficult. Not because it is confusing, but because it is clear in a way that doesn't fit the usual rules. There is no perfect explanation, no simple label, no sentence that captures everything. It simply exists. And maybe some things are not meant to be explained immediately. Maybe some things are meant to be experienced first, understood later, defined only when they naturally become clear. Because forcing meaning onto something too early can sometimes destroy the very thing you are trying to understand. So I don't want to rush this. I don't want to turn something rare into something ordinary by trying to control every detail. I just want to acknowledge what is true. You changed something, not because you tried, not because you entered my life with a purpose, but because your presence reached a place that most things never reach. A place where thoughts become quieter, where honesty becomes easier, where being seen doesn't feel threatening. And that is something I cannot ignore, because the truth is, some people enter your life and become memories. Some people enter your life and become lessons, but very few become a different way of seeing the world. And you became that, not an interruption, not a distraction, not something temporary, a shift, a quiet shift that happened so naturally I almost missed it. Until I realized I was no longer seeing things the same way. Until I realized your presence had become part of the way I process moments, part of the way I understand certain feelings, part of the way I recognize things I once overlooked. And maybe that is what makes this meaningful. Not that you changed who I am, but that you helped me notice who I already was. And once someone gives you that kind of clarity, you don't forget it. You carry it quickly, completely. And whether this becomes something more or simply remains what it is, truth remains the same. Something real happened here. Something I didn't plan. Something I didn't expect. Something I couldn't force. It was simply recognized. And sometimes recognition is the beginning of the things that matter most. I think the hardest part about something like this is not discovering it. It's accepting that it exists, because discovery gives you distance. You can observe something you have discovered, you can analyze it, you can question it, you can convince yourself that you are still in control. But acceptance is different. Acceptance means admitting that something has already reached a place inside you where it has influence. And that is where things become complicated. Because I have always believed that awareness gives me control. If I understand something, I can handle it. If I can explain something, I can manage it. If I can define something, I can decide what role it plays in my life. But what happens when something refuses to be defined? What happens when something is real before it has a name? That is where I found myself with you. Not searching for answers anymore, not trying to prove whether this was meaningful, just quietly realizing that it already was. And that realization changed the way I looked at everything. Because before you, I was comfortable with the idea that every connection had a beginning, a clear starting point, a moment where two people slowly move from strangers into familiarity. There is usually a process, a timeline, a reason. But this felt different. It didn't feel like something being created, it felt like something being recognized. And recognition is a strange thing, because it creates a feeling of returning to something you have never experienced before. A feeling that says, I don't know where this came from, but somehow, uh, it makes sense. That is what made it difficult, not the connection itself, the lack of explanation. I have always trusted things I could understand, but you introduced me to something I could feel before I could explain, and that forced me to question something I rarely question, my own certainty. Because maybe not everything meaningful arrives with instructions. Maybe not everything important comes with a clear reason. Maybe some things simply appear and ask you to pay attention, and I paid attention more than I expected. I noticed the small things, the things most people overlook, the way conversations felt different, the way time seemed to move differently when there was a genuine understanding between us, the way I didn't feel the usual need to protect every thought before sharing it. That was unusual for me, creating a version of myself that can exist anywhere, a version that can adapt, a version that can function without revealing too much. It is easier that way, less complicated, less risky. When people only know what you choose to show them, there is comfort in that. There is safety. But then, someone comes along who notices what you never intended to display. And suddenly, the walls you built don't feel as necessary. That is what happened. Not because you forced them down, but because they stopped feeling useful. And that difference matters. Anyone can break through someone's defenses, but very few people make those defenses feel unnecessary. You did not make me feel exposed. You made me feel understood. And those are completely different things. Being exposed feels like losing control. Being understood feels like finally not needing to hold everything alone. That is why this affected me differently. Because I didn't feel like I was giving something away. I felt like I was finally allowing something to exist naturally. And maybe that is what connection really is. Not finding someone who takes pieces of you, finding someone around whom you no longer feel the need to hide them. I think about that often. The fact that you never demanded a version of me, you never expected a performance, you never needed me to constantly prove what I felt or explain what I meant. You simply noticed. And sometimes being noticed is more powerful than being pursued, because pursuit can come from desire, but understanding comes from attention. And attention is rare, real attention. The kind where someone is not just waiting for their turn to speak, the kind where someone actually observes, actually listens, actually sees. That kind of presence changes things. It creates a space where honesty becomes easier. Not because you are suddenly fearless, but because you no longer feel like honesty will be misunderstood. And that is something I never realized I needed until I experienced it. There is a strange comfort in being around someone who doesn't require constant explanation. Someone who can understand the meaning behind a pause. Someone who can recognize when silence means peace instead of distance. Someone who knows that not every feeling needs to become a conversation immediately. Some things exist before they become words, and maybe that is what makes this different. It exists beyond language, beyond explanations, beyond the usual ways people measure closeness, because most people measure connection by how much they know about someone. But maybe the deeper measure is how naturally you understand them, not their history, not every detail, but their essence, the way they move through the world, the way they experience things, the way their mind works. And that is what I recognized. A similarity beneath everything visible, a shared way of processing, a familiar rhythm. Not identical lives, not identical experiences, just a similar way of existing. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is the thing people spend years searching for. Someone who doesn't just hear your words, someone who understands the place those words are coming from. That is rare, and rare things create hesitation. Because when something is uncommon, you become careful with it. You start questioning every possibility. You start wondering whether you are seeing reality or simply hoping for it. But the strange thing is, AB never felt like I had to convince myself. I never had to create reasons. I never had to force meaning into moments. The meaning was already there. Quiet, consistent, present. And consistency is what makes something believable. Anyone can create a moment, anyone can create an impression. But patterns reveal truth. And the pattern here has always been the same. A feeling of understanding without pressure. A feeling of closeness without demand. A feeling that something important exists, even when nothing dramatic is happening. That is what stands out. The absence of effort. Because the strongest connections are not always the ones that require constant work to maintain. Sometimes they are the ones that feel natural, even in stillness. And stillness is where I noticed the most. Not in the big conversations, not in the obvious moments, but in the quiet spaces, the moments where nothing needed to happen, the moments where there was no expectation. That is when I realized this was different, because when something is only based on excitement, it disappears when there is nothing happening. But when something is based on understanding, silence does not weaken it. Silence reveals it. And what I found there surprised me. I found that your presence had become familiar, not because I had memorized you, but because I had started recognizing the effect you had, the way things felt different, the way my thoughts became clearer, the way certain parts of myself became easier to acknowledge, and that is when I understood something important. Maybe the strongest connections are not the ones where another person completes your story. Maybe they are the ones where another person helps you read your own story more clearly. You became a reflection not of who I wanted to be, but of who I already was. And that kind of reflection is powerful because it does not create an illusion. It removes one. It removes the idea that you have to constantly become someone else to be understood. It reminds you that being yourself was always enough. And maybe that is the real reason this feels different, because you didn't just make me feel connected to you, you made me feel more connected to myself. And that is something I never expected. Something I never searched for, something I never planned. But now that it exists, AB cannot pretend it doesn't. Because some encounters leave a mark, not because they are dramatic, not because they change everything instantly, but because after them, you notice things you never noticed before. You understand things differently. You see yourself differently. And that kind of change is quiet. But quiet does not mean small. Sometimes the quietest changes are the ones that last the longest. And I think that is what this became. Not a sudden transformation, a gradual realization, a slow understanding that something had shifted, something inside, something permanent. And maybe the most honest thing I can say is this. I don't know exactly where this leads. I don't know what name it deserves. I don't know what the future will make of it. But I know what it is right now. It is real. It is meaningful. And it is something I no longer want to ignore.